Shortly after dawn, Allied airfields across Europe began reporting losses that made no immediate sense. Aircraft were failing to return. Others never made it airborne. Crews waited beside empty runways as operations schedules quietly collapsed. Within hours, commanders were confronted with an unthinkable reality. Allied air power was hemorrhaging at a scale unseen since the early days of the war. This was not the result of a single ambush or a decisive enemy offensive. It was something far more dangerous, a systemic failure unfolding faster than anyone could control. By the end of the day, hundreds of Allied aircraft were gone, destroyed, or rendered useless, and the assumption that the Allies held unshakable control of the skies was shattered. What made this day the worst in Allied aviation history was not just the number of aircraft lost, but how suddenly and how quietly it happened. The background to the disaster lay in success itself. By this stage of World War II, Allied air forces operated at a tempo never before attempted. Aircraft were launched continuously, often from overcrowded forward airfields stretched beyond their designed capacity. Command structures emphasized relentless pressure. Keep aircraft flying, keep targets burning, keep the enemy off balance. This mindset left little room for delay or reconsideration. Weather forecasts were accepted with optimism, maintenance backlogs were tolerated, fuel, spare parts, and replacement crews were assumed to be available when needed. On paper, the numbers supported that confidence. Allied production dwarfed Axis output, and losses could be absorbed, or so planners believed. But on this particular day, every weakness in that system aligned at once. Aircraft were launched into deteriorating conditions. Navigation errors multiplied, landing strips became bottlenecks as damaged planes attempted emergency returns. Others ran out of fuel, searching for alternate fields that were already full or unusable. Some aircraft never encountered the enemy at all, yet still failed to survive the mission. As the hours passed, the situation worsened rather than stabilized. Reports from individual units painted fragments of the picture, but no one yet grasped the whole. A squadron commander might report 12 aircraft missing. Another might report 8 destroyed on the ground after forced landings. Elsewhere, bombers diverted hundreds of miles off course were abandoned when recovery proved impossible. What made the losses so severe was not a single catastrophic mistake, but the inability to stop the process once it began. Air operations are tightly sequenced systems. Aircraft take off, land, refuel, rearm, and launch again in a precise rhythm. On this day, that rhythm collapsed. Airfields clogged with damaged aircraft blocked incoming traffic. Maintenance crews were overwhelmed. Commanders hesitated to cancel missions already airborne, fearing chaos would increase rather than decrease. Each decision, rational in isolation, compounded the damage. By the time higher headquarters recognized the scale of the failure, the losses were already irreversible. Allied air power had not been defeated by enemy brilliance, but by its own momentum, and the realization would force a painful reckoning. By mid-morning, what had begun as scattered loss reports turned into a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. Operations rooms across Allied commands started to see the same markers appear again and again. Aircraft overdue by hours, emergency landings clogging secondary fields, entire formations failing to reassemble after missions. The losses were no longer abstract numbers, but operational gaps. Bomber streams that were meant to arrive in coordinated waves came in broken fragments or not at all. Fighter cover was thinner than planned, leaving returning aircraft exposed at their most vulnerable moments. In some sectors, missions were still being launched even as previous waves had not yet returned, creating an accumulation effect that multiplied risk rather than distributing it. The air war depended on timing and flow. That day, both were breaking down simultaneously. Each hour that passed did not stabilize the situation. It accelerated it. The most dangerous phase came when the airfields themselves became part of the problem. Forward bases, already strained by months of continuous use, were suddenly overwhelmed by damaged aircraft attempting emergency landings. Runways were blocked by crash landings. Refueling crews were stretched beyond endurance. Navigation errors caused by weather and exhaustion sent aircraft circling for landing slots that no longer existed. Some crews were forced to ditch aircraft simply because there was nowhere left to land. Others abandoned planes that could have been repaired under normal circumstances but were written off due to time pressure and lack of capacity. This was where the losses quietly exploded, not in combat reports or dramatic encounters, but in logistics logs and maintenance tallies. Aircraft that survived enemy fire were still being lost in large numbers, grounded, cannibalized for parts, or destroyed to prevent obstruction. The air power that was supposed to overwhelm the enemy had turned inward, consuming its own infrastructure. Command decisions made under intense pressure unintentionally deepened the crisis. Canceling missions already airborne risked collisions and fuel exhaustion. Continuing them risked further losses on return. Higher headquarters hesitated, waiting for clarity that never came in time. Communications lagged behind reality, meaning orders were often based on an operational picture that was already obsolete. In several instances, squadrons were instructed to proceed as planned even though their recovery fields were no longer viable. These were not reckless decisions, but the result of a system designed for efficiency, not failure at scale. Allied air doctrine assumed losses would be spread over time and space. That assumption failed catastrophically on this day. By late afternoon, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Aircraft counts showed a collapse in available strength that could not be hidden by optimistic reporting. The losses were no longer just tactical, they were strategic. Planned operations for the following days had to be scaled back or postponed, not because of enemy action, but because the air forces simply could not regenerate fast enough. For the first time in the later war years, Allied commanders had to confront a deeply unsettling truth. Air superiority, once thought permanent, could be temporarily broken without the enemy ever seizing the initiative. The full consequences only became clear in the days that followed, when planners attempted to resume operations and discovered how deeply the losses had cut. Aircraft numbers on paper still looked impressive, but operational readiness told a different story. Squadrons that should have been combat-capable were grounded due to missing crews, damaged runways, or aircraft pulled apart for spare parts. Replacement machines existed, but not where they were needed, and not with trained crews ready to fly them immediately. Air power depends not just on production, but on continuity, trained personnel, functioning infrastructure, and predictable cycles. That continuity had been broken. Missions scheduled for the following days were quietly reduced or canceled, targets reprioritized, and timelines adjusted. None of this was announced publicly. To do so would have exposed a vulnerability the Allies could not afford to reveal. Outwardly, the air war continued. Internally, the shock was profound. Senior commanders understood that they had come dangerously close to losing control of the air, not through enemy superiority, but through overconfidence in their own systems. Investigations followed, conducted with urgency but little publicity. Reports focused not on blame, but on failure chains, how small, acceptable risks had accumulated into an operational catastrophe. Weather tolerance was reassessed. Airfield capacity limits were rewritten. Recovery planning, long treated as secondary to offensive output, was elevated to a central concern. The idea that aircraft could always divert safely was exposed as dangerously optimistic. Doctrine began to shift away from maximum tempo toward controlled sustainability. The lesson was clear and uncomfortable. Air power could destroy an enemy's capacity to fight, but only if it respected its own physical and logistical limits. The Allies did not abandon mass air operations after this day, but they learned to space them, buffer them, and protect the infrastructure that made them possible. The worst day for Allied air power did not change the outcome of the war, but it came close enough to force a reckoning. It revealed that dominance in the skies was not guaranteed by numbers alone, and that even the strongest force could stumble into crisis if momentum replaced judgment. That understanding, born from loss rather than victory, would shape Allied air strategy for the remainder of World War II.